and welcome to today's risk reduction, risk management class, where we're going to talk about the new RPA and some of the associated questions and issues that have come up regarding the RPA. There's a few nuances in the RPA that would be good for agents to be aware of and take advantage of, and some changes from the old RPA, which might require you to think a little differently as you administer transactions under the new RPA. At the end, I think this class will move along fairly quickly. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions at all about any aspect of the RPA, by all means, we can discuss them here in this forum and perhaps get some answers for you. So with that being said, let's get started. I will share my screen. As always, anytime you have a question, there's 3 ways to reach me. And then finally, for weekends and evenings, my cell number is on the screen there. And I recommend that you text me and ask me to call you. Let's jump right into today's class, and that is the new RPA and some challenges and questions that have come up. And I'm going to go through a few of the areas somewhat briefly, a little bit of detail as necessary. And if you have questions in these particular areas, you could even interrupt me and ask questions as we go through this. And like I said, at the end, any questions you have, I'm happy to talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is assignments. And this new RPA makes a significant change regarding assignments. Contracts are normally assignable unless prohibited or restricted within the contract. Our RPA has some restrictions to the assignment. The old RPA did not have too many restrictions to the assignment, so it was pretty easy to do it, and it was pretty easy to do it at the 11th hour, which often happened. The problem with doing that is escrow and the listing side of the transaction is now scrambling, trying to get the paperwork with the new buyers in place and get signatures on all the disclosures, which is very, very important. And sometimes that's being done the night before it's going to close because the assignment was just announced that morning. So the new RPA restricts within the contract the right of the buyer to request an assignment to the first 17 days after acceptance. Now, the contract says that a seller must reasonably accommodate the request and cannot deny the request unless they have cause. It also says any request made after 17 days, the seller is being reasonable in denying the request. What does that mean in English? What it means in English is if you request the assignment on the 18th or 19th or 20th day and the seller says no, you don't have a lot of recourse. So the first thing I would advise you is to be sure if you're going to do an assignment that you do it within the first 17 days. Usually, and so that should be done early on. Now, I want to address something. I don't have a slide here, but now's a good time to talk about it. I don't see it too much, but I saw it just the other day, and not picking on anybody because it's a common practice, or was a common practice. Courts have repeatedly invalidated contracts that the buyer is stated as an entity, a person, John Jones, or assignee. One of the principles of contract law is the principles have to be identified. You can't do a contract with an unknown entity. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. How can a seller hold an unknown party to the contract or vice versa? So the parties must be named, and it has happened more than a few times. Lawsuits have been filed and the buyer was named as an or assignee, and the court invalidated the contract completely. So you don't want to do that. So avoid the or in naming the buyer. The buyer can always add the assignee by making a request. And if it's unless it's an unreasonable request, the seller must grant that request. I often make this example. When you put or in statements like that, imagine if the sale price was $750,000 or $800,000. I mean, everybody would say, well, that's crazy. I mean, which one is it? It's the exact same thing with or assignee. So don't use that, and you should counter that out. A lot of escrows, including ours, will immediately put out an addendum that the assignee must be named, because escrow can't do, how do they do their escrow paperwork when they don't know who the buyer is or an assignee who's not named? So avoid that. Okay. Paragraph 23 gives some details about assignment, and I want to go through a few of them with you. The first thing, this comes up frequently, and that is the buyer wants to assign it to his own or her own trust or their own wholly owned entity. So if they are the only principal in the entity or they're assigning it to their own trust, they do not need the seller's permission. They can simply do an addendum and name that as the buyer. And so that's the first thing I want to point out. And the good news is, from a seller's perspective, if a buyer has signed everything as an individual and now wants to assign it to his wholly owned entity. And again, wholly owned means he's the only owner, not part owner, but the only owner. If the LLC has one other owner, one other principal, even a minority principal, then you have to go through the permission process, and you have to do it within the 17 days to avoid the seller saying no. So a wholly owned entity or a trust, the buyer has signed all the disclosures. Now they want to put it into his trust. You do not need the disclosures re-signed. The courts will never say, well, gee, as an individual, he got those documents, but as a trustee, he's never seen them. I mean, that's ludicrous on the face of it. So you don't have to worry about that. So that's the first thing I want to point out. Don't have too much heartburn over somebody who says, you know what, we want to put this in our trust. So husband and wife, they bought it, and now they want to put it in their own trust. That's a simple process. It doesn't need the seller's permission. Do not need to go back and re-sign paperwork. All right. The other issue is, of course, you do need written consent for a specified assignee, and you do that with the AOAA document. You name who the assignee is. Another thing I want to point out is, if there's a monetary consideration provided to the buyer by the assignee, the person who's receiving the assignment, that must be disclosed to the seller. And CAR believes that if the buyer assigns it to another entity, and the buyer is represented by a licensed agent, and that other entity is paying the buyer significant money to get that property, and the buyer's not doing anything to it, that could be problematic. The seller might have grounds to cancel because he could have sold it directly to that entity. So that's why that's in there. It's in there to advise a seller that, you may have sort of been duped into selling your house for way less than you could have sold it if this assignee had come forward to buy the house directly. So, some flippers, they fix up the property. That's fine. It doesn't affect them. But when somebody is simply flipping the transaction, getting their name on a transaction, and then making $25,000 to name somebody else, that could be problematic. But so the monetary consideration must be disclosed. If the seller's okay with it, then no harm, no foul. And sometimes that's maybe in the seller's best interest, just to let them assign it, let the buyer pay that money. Meanwhile, you get your property sold for a price you were at one time happy with. Okay, now the buyer must provide all the documents to the assignee, and the assignee must re-sign everything. And that's critical. And that's good to be in the contract, because we've required that for a long time. And sometimes we got pushback from the other side, the buyer's side, when we didn't represent the buyer's side. That and here's a point I want to make also. Escrow will sometimes say, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just do an addendum, and we'll just say that the buyer accepts and acknowledges all the disclosures that have been provided. Do not do that. That will not work if a lawsuit's been filed later, because the buyer will say, well, there was something in those that I didn't know about because you didn't tell me about it. So you want the buyer's, the assignee's signature on all the documents. Back to why that 17 days is the deadline for doing an assignment. So there's plenty of time to get the assignee's signature on the paperwork. Okay. The assignee must be pre-qualified if in fact they're going to get the loan, and must provide pre-qualification or pre-approval, just as the buyer did. And again, if the buyer fails to provide that information to the seller within that 17-day window, including naming the assignee, the seller can reasonably withhold consent. Withholding of consent shall be deemed reasonable. And of course, an assignment is always done on an AOAA. Never, never, never do an assignment on simply an addendum. By the way, when a buyer is added, that is an assignment by legal definition. So buyer Jones bought the property, and now he wants to add his brother to the property and to the purchase contract, but he's going to stay on the purchase contract. Well, then he would be assigning it to himself and his brother. And so there'd be an assignment to two people, one of which was already on the contract, and then the brother would be the second person. So you add buyers with assignments. You don't need assignments to delete buyers, but you do need assignments to add buyers. Okay, so I hope that kind of clears up any issues with assignments. And if anybody doesn't have any questions about assignments, I will move on to the next topic, which is contingencies. And that's a big one, right? So as you all know, paragraph 3L itemizes all the contingencies. And I want to talk about probably the 2 or 3 most common contingencies that I deal with question-wise. Of course, a big contingency is a loan contingency, but I'm not going to be talking about that today unless you have a question about it. But I am going to talk about the appraisal contingency. There's a few features of the appraisal contingency that I still get quite a few questions on. And so I want to be sure that everybody has the benefit of maybe an overall discussion of the appraisal contingent. Now, first thing I want to point out, I forgot to, let me go back. Notice that the contingencies are all boilerplate 17 days. They've standardized those. And so most of you have picked up on that. And so the appraisal contingency then is in fact 17 days after acceptance. Once the 17 days are gone, the seller compel the buyer to remove the appraisal contingency if there is one. I know we have a lot of transactions today that don't have appraisal contingencies or have modified appraisal contingencies, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit. So the appraisal contingency is discussed in paragraph 8 of the purchase contract, and let me outline a few things. The first thing, 17 days after acceptance is the time frame. Some agents are changing that a bit. Sometimes in the downward fashion. So if you take it down to 10, be sure your lender is going to be able to get the appraisal back to the buyer within that 10-day window. If the seller counters a smaller appraisal window, be sure your buyer can perform during that. Now, you can also have no appraisal contingency, and that is one of 2 contingencies that can be removed on the RPA without a CR being necessary, a contingency removal form being necessary. So the other one is the loan contingency, which is L1. So either L1 or L2, L2 the appraisal contingency, L1 the loan contingency. There's a box to check if you don't want appraisal contingency, and it's pretty much a done deal. Now, keep in mind, we talked about this before, if the loan specified on the contract is a FHA or VA loan, then an FVAC is going to be required, and that has an appraisal contingency cancellation right, sort of a second contingency, if you will, which cannot be waived, notwithstanding any other document in the transaction. The buyer shall not forfeit his deposit if he fails to purchase the property and the appraisal did not come in at the purchase price. So that is that's in there. So keep that in mind. When you have FHA, VA offers, you really can't remove the appraisal contingency. You can't modify it either. I mean, you can attempt to do it. A buyer can tell you, look, I'm a VA buyer, but I don't care. I got plenty of money in the bank. I'm going to buy it. Well, he can. And if he's honorable and he's going to do it, he will buy it regardless of the appraisal. But if he changes his mind because the appraisal came in low, no CR will stand up against the FVAC. So keep that in mind. Now, you can use a contingency removal form to remove a contingency, and of course, and usually appraisal contingencies are removed later in the transaction, and that's contained in paragraph 2 of the CR. The buyer is removing the appraisal contingency, or there's another box elsewhere in the form you can remove all contingencies, which would include the appraisal as well. Now, the modification of the appraisal contingency, I get a lot of questions on that. And if you are confused, don't hesitate to call me. It's a fairly straightforward calculation. Here's what I generally have talked to the agent about. I generally talk about that the list price was probably somewhere near the comps. Sometimes no, sometimes, in this market, sellers getting away with way overpricing property anyway. But let's assume the list price is relatively close to the comps. Why is that important? Because the boilerplate about the appraisal contingency is the purchase price. So whatever the purchase price is, not what the comps are, but what the purchase price is, that's the threshold for the appraisal contingency. So if the property is listed pretty close to the comps, one's going to assume the appraisal will come in on or near the purchase price. I got comps for $700,000. I'm probably going to get an appraisal of $700,000. Now, if my purchase price is $700,000, then, no problem. But what if I want to pay $750,000 and I'm willing to pay $50,000 over the appraisal? Well, then the way you do that is you simply modify the appraisal contingency threshold, if you will, downward by $50,000. I hope I kind of didn't confuse you too much. Let me go back and go through that again. A property is listed at $700,000. Assuming it's priced right, you got comps at $700,000. The buyer is willing to pay $750,000, including $50,000 over appraisal. Well, we're going to get a $700,000 appraisal. So the way, if you don't modify the appraisal contingency, it's got to appraise at $750,000 because that's the purchase price. So you modify the appraisal contingency not to the purchase price. That's the boilerplate. So that's the boilerplate, a minimum of the purchase price, or, so the purchase price is $750,000. The list is $700,000. You got comps at $700,000. You put $700,000 on that blank. You come down. If you're willing to pay X dollars over the appraisal, you would go to that number of dollars, below the purchase price, because it's going to be, the appraisal is going to come in probably at the list price, not the purchase price. But the appraisal contingency the threshold can be reduced below the purchase price to a number you think it will appraise at. So if it's listed at 700, you think it will appraise at 700, but you're willing to pay 750, you can say, as long as it appraises at 700, I'll pay the 50,000. See, and that protects the buyer. Let's say the seller was crazy and maybe you weren't paying attention to the comps as well as you could, and it comes in at 650. Well, you set the minimum at 700, so you're protected. I don't need to buy it for 750 when I get an appraisal at 650 because I set the threshold at the list price of 700. So that's, protects the buyer from an appraisal that's way below what everybody thought it would be, but it also illustrates to the seller that you're willing to pay over appraisal because the assumption is going to be it's going to appraise pretty close to the list price. And you don't have to use the list price per se because you don't know for sure if the seller's listed it correctly or not. So you do your own comps. You figure out what the appraisal will come in at regardless of the purchase price, and you set where you think the appraisal will come in at as the threshold number. So you do your math and you think, I think his appraisal is going to come in at 680 and we'll pay 50,000 over appraisal. But I think it's going to be 680. Well, then put 680 in there because that's where you believe the comps will take it, even though you're paying 750. Of course, if it comes in at 680, you're paying, 70,000 over list price. So maybe you come down a little bit. If it's 680, what you think the comps are, you're probably going to be paying 730. Okay.
Hey, Walt.
Yes.
I just want to clarify, then we don't need to write any statements in our offer.
Oh, thank you for that question. You do not write any statements, because the problem with writing statements is you create some ambiguity as to whether the buyer is expecting to buy the house and the seller has to sell the house at some dollar amount above the appraisal. So the buyer shall pay or buyer to pay, that's what I see, which is not good language anyway in a contract, but buyer to pay 50,000 over appraisal. Well, the fear is a court could say, okay, seller agreed to that. So the appraisal comes in at 680, buyer only pays 730 because he said to pay $50 over appraisal. No, seller wants that 750. So don't write anything. All you need to do is put a number here. And the number is, what do you think it'll appraise at? That's the number you put in there. And because the boilerplate says the purchase price is where it has to appraise at. Now, if you're buying it full price, then you're not even messing with this clause right here. But if you're paying 50,000 over full price and you're willing to do that, well, the boilerplate says it needs to appraise at your 50,000 over full price, and it won't. So you go ahead and put in the number. What is the comps? What should it comp in at? What will the appraisal come in at? As long as it appraises at that number, I'll pay the extra dollars. I'm recognizing I'm paying more than what it's going to appraise for. Did that answer your question? Excellent. Okay. All right.
That was good. Thank you.
Okay. And now let's move on to the investigation of property contingency. And that is a specific contingency contained within the RPA. And a lot of times people mix that up as the physical inspection contingency. There is no listed physical inspection contingency. Now, what confuses everybody is the CR breaks up the investigation contingency in the portions. So you can remove just the physical inspection of your investigation of the property and keep all the other things you're investigating on the CR. But you're breaking up the investigation contingency on the CR. Now, if you are removing the investigation of contingency with the purchase contract, then you would check this CR attached down below and actually attach the CR and state what you are in fact removing with the property. Now, you might not want to remove all of the investigation property, but you might be willing to say, I don't care about the physical inspection. So you would attach the CR and just remove that portion of the investigation contingency that is associated with the physical inspection. Now, a question has come up, and it was an interesting nuance, and I want to make sure everyone understands. Removing the physical inspection contingency is not the same thing as a waiver of the physical inspection contingency in, I guess I'll be blunt, in Walt Clyne's mind. And Walt Clyne thinks we don't want to be sued. Walt Clyne thinks my job is that when you work as hard as you do to earn the commission you do, you should get to keep it. And I don't like buyers and sellers changing the rules after close of escrow and then coming after our agents because they had a change of heart about something. I honestly believe, with very, very, very few exceptions, all of our people do an excellent, excellent job of taking very good care of their clients, but we often have clients with selective memory after close of escrow. They don't remember that you said, are you sure you want to not have a physical inspection contingency? This house is 20 years old. No, I want this house. I want this house. I don't care. I'm competing with other offers. Yeah, but what if it's got problems? I don't care. Okay. And you remove the investigation contingency with your purchase contract. And then after close of escrow, they discover a cracked slab. And then, of course, they don't remember that conversation. See, that's where the selective memory comes in. I don't want to call them liars. I do recognize that they sort of don't remember exactly what happened. So if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Keep that in mind. So along with removing the physical inspection contingency portion of the investigation of property contingency, include a waiver of the physical inspection. And we have two, and I like them both, quite frankly. We have a RE/MAX Connections form. It's a form I wrote years and years and years ago. And it's kind of nice in the sense that it's kind of plain English, gee, you really ought to get an inspection, and they're not that expensive. There could be things wrong with this property. The seller doesn't know, and the agents aren't going to figure it out by doing an AVI. So, are you sure you don't want to do an inspection? We're recommending you do one. It's pretty simple English. And so that's an agent hub. And the CAR also has a waiver of inspection form, and you can use that one. Either one will work. Both of them is redundancy. Larry and I joke about it all the time. Redundancy in real estate paperwork is a good thing because it gives us more than one document to point at should there be a claim later. Okay, well, you were confused about Form A, but what about Form B? You signed that one too. Were you still confused? So that helps a lot. And so the BIW is the CAR form. So the fact that the physical inspection contingency has been waived, we still want the form of the waiver. We want that. The contract's going to need the CR. The seller's going to want the CR. You're removing that contingency, but we want a form where we have on paper that's against our advice. Still do it. You may have to do it to get the house. We understand that. Okay. All right, investigation of property is contained in two paragraphs. One is 8C, pretty straightforward. And then paragraph 12 has quite a bit of detail about the investigation of the property. And what it does is it does a nice job of explaining the various components of investigation of the property. So when you look at the form, you can see as you go down the form, it conducts investigations, inspections, investigation, tests, surveys, and any studies. And, things like a physical home inspection, a lead-based paint inspection, or other lead-based paint hazards, wood destroying pest inspection. And it also references the BIA, any items as outlined in the BIA. And so the BIA is a nice form. Often agents sort of just look at that as just one more piece of paper on the stack of papers you're having a buyer sign. But this is a good form to review with a buyer because it outlines in some detail all the various things that a buyer might want to investigate as a part of their investigation period. Now, another thing I want to point out, and it's contained in paragraph 12, and that is that the seller is entitled to copies, 12D, right in here. Buyer shall give seller at no cost complete copies of all reports obtained by the buyer. And this obligation should survive the termination of the agreement. And the reason that's in there is so they get a physical inspection, they don't like the condition of the house, and then they cancel it. And then they say, we're not obligated to give you the report because our contract's been canceled. Well, this particular clause, this particular requirement survives the cancellation of the contract. If you ever have a buyer who will not provide you any reports that they got, and after your best efforts, and you can determine what your best efforts are, if it's one call and that's it, that's okay. If it's 10 calls and 10 emails and still not working and you're frustrated, my point being, call me, call Larry. We will get that. Knock on wood, I don't think I've ever not gotten one because I've got a little speech that I give the buyer's agent when they are telling me they're not going to provide it to us. They don't care what the contract says. And sometimes people tell us that. Well, we had one buyer who paid $5,000 for a soils inspection, and he insisted that, he's not going to give that up because it's worth $5,000, but he will sell it to us for $2,000. No, at no cost. We got the report. We want those reports because it can be problematic in a lawsuit later because we're aware of a report, but we don't have it. And now we've got to demonstrate that we made good faith effort to get it. We can't simply say, oh, don't send it to me. I don't want it because I don't want to taint my property. Because as all of you know on this call, you have to give that report to the next buyer. And if that's a problem, call me. And there's ways to handle that as well. But we get copies of reports even when they cancel. Now, if they don't cancel, we want them to, because often the reports contain information in them that the buyer doesn't read, but then we have a copy that the buyer got it. I'll give you a real quick example of that. We had a buyer one time close on an escrow, and about a month after escrow closed, they finally investigated the odd sounds that came from the attic. The attic was completely rat infested. They actually freaked out. They put their head up through the little hatchway, and there were mice, or my wife calls them rats. There are rats running all over the place. We have a lot of, I call them mice. My wife calls them rats in Scripps Ranch, in everybody's backyard. We've got them all over the place. So this house was infested with rats to the point they were still living there. And so the buyer calls exterminating service, and the exterminating service says to the buyer, do you want us to continue with the exterminating program we started with the previous owner? And of course, there was nothing in the disclosures about rat infestation. So initially, we thought we had a claim against the seller because they had started exterminating the rats, but apparently certainly didn't complete it. And we happened to stumble upon the very company that was doing that for the buyer. The listing agent was horrified until he sent me an email and said, check out the physical inspection report we gave you from the previous buyer. Previous buyer canceled. And why did they cancel? Because there was a page-long discussion by that physical inspector about the rats and how hard it'll be to get rid of them. And that was in the previous inspection report that was sent to the buyer. When I called the buyer, they said, "Oh, I didn't read it." Well, it was disclosed. So, the good news is the listing agent got a copy of that inspection report and then, of course, gave it to the buyer. And because they had a copy of that report, they were protected. Imagine if our buyer was the first buyer and got the report and didn't read it, but bought the house anyway. We actually had another buyer who had bought a big house, paid $700 or $800 for a physical inspection, never read it. And of course, after close of escrow, had quite a few claims, many of which were covered in the physical inspection. So we want copies of all the reports the buyer gets. That's real critical. Okay, as I had mentioned before, this is how you can break up the investigation of property contingency. You can remove all of the investigation contingency, only that part related to inspections, or all the investigations except that part related to inspections, or you can name some specific portion of the contingency you want to keep. If you're filling in a blank here, give me or Larry a call and let us be sure you're naming something you can name. For example, all except repair request. Guess what? There is no repair request stated in any contingency clauses. So you don't have a repair request contingency. We've had more than one buyer. Good news is not our buyers, but reserve their repair request contingency. Well, they don't have one. So they removed everything except the contingency they don't have anyway. So if you're not sure, give us a call on what you put in that blank.
Well,
yes.
Can I ask you to elaborate or at least counsel our listing agents? We've run into this a couple of times where a physical inspection was done by the buyer. Buyer's agent calls listing agent and says, "Hey, we've done the inspection and we got a lot of problems with this property and we've decided we're going to cancel. I'm going to send you over the inspection report." And the listing agent / seller says, No, I don't want that report. Don't send it to me. We've had that come up a couple of times. And how do we want to counsel our listing agents when that comes up, when the buyer says, the seller says, "I don't want that report"?
Never allow that to be. In other words, as a listing agent, never say that, because you have an obligation to get that report, and you cannot insulate you or our company because you refuse to accept the report. That's almost as bad as having the report and not liking it, and so you don't want to give it to them.
Exactly. But we've actually had a case where the listing agent was the seller and told us, no, we don't want that report. I don't want that report. I'm going to have to give it to the next. We did explain it to them. Actually, had a long conversation with them, and they ultimately agreed to it. But if you're not aware of that, it could be a problem.
Yeah. I remember one agent, I won't name her. I actually remember who the agent was, a very sweet agent. Kathy got a phone call, and the buyer said, "You know what, Kathy, you're such a nice agent. This report's horrible. This inspector was horrible. I'm going to do you a favor and not send it to you." And this was years ago. And Kathy commented to me or Larry, how nice that was. And she didn't have to deal with it, which we said, "Oh, no, you got to get it." So yeah, don't, if your seller has a problem with a bad report from a previous escrow and you're having a problem with that, give me or Larry a call. I'm happy to talk to your seller. I'm very, very user friendly. Those of you who had me talk to your clients, I think you would all agree, I handle it pretty well. And I've never not gotten reports or gotten sellers to agree that those reports have to be provided. So just like Rick, called about, the seller was a little concerned about a criminal thing that happened on the property and wasn't sure they should disclose it and didn't really want to disclose it. What do we do? Well, there's dialogue. There are things to say. Rick handled it very well, apparently, because the seller came around. I saw what they wrote. It was beautiful. They did a nice job in the end. If you're having a problem with that, by all means, give us a call. Let us help you with that. But you don't want to take the route of, as long as I haven't seen it, I don't have to worry about it. No, you know it's there, and so you do have to deal with it. All right, informational. That cover it, Larry?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Informational access to the property. That is not a contingency. I mean, it's almost unfortunate they listed it there, but they do state that it's not a contingency there. So it's even though it's listed in the contingency paragraph. So even when a buyer removes all their contingencies, they have 17 days to investigate the property. Still, they just don't have any contingency left if they've removed the contingency. So keep that in mind. The fact that a buyer has removed their contingencies does not preclude them from getting access to the property to investigate the property. Okay. Review of seller's documents contingency. That is new in this RPA. That is an itemized separate contingency. And there's a little bit of a problem in the RPA. I don't want to get into the weeds too much. I think there needs to be a revision of the RPA because they've included it in one place as part of the investigation of property contingency in one paragraph, and then in another they separate it. So that is a little bit of a confusion. But the buyer has 17 days to review seller documents after acceptance, or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Now, if they remove contingencies and then get the report, it does not reinstate the contingency. That's important to know. I've had buyers, agents tell me that since this is a separate contingency, even if we remove contingencies, if they give us the reports, then we get that back, right? No, you don't, with the exception of the statutory disclosures, because those can't be waived, so like the TDS or the FHDS or the lead-based paint disclosure. But anything else, the SBQ, well, SBQ can be a part of the TDS, and that could be a problem. But in general, once you get seller documents, that doesn't reinstate contingencies. Now, you have the same window of time to review those as you do your investigation period, so should not be a problem. All right, and that's contained in paragraph 8D. And also 14A talks about the time periods. The contingency removal discusses that in paragraph D, review of seller documents. That's a unique contingency. So that's kind of nice. As a listing agent, keep in mind that if the buyer removes his investigation contingencies, but does not remove his review of seller documents contingency, he might be able to still bail on a transaction and get the deposit back. That is a separate contingency. So be aware of that. Removing the investigation contingency does not remove the reviewing seller documents contingency. All right, possession, very briefly, but I want to point out a couple of very important things. There's three paragraphs that discuss, in paragraph three subparagraphs that discuss possession, and then there's more detail within the body of the RPA. So the first one is a time of possession, and the big change is it went back to upon recordation. It used to be at 6 p.m. or now it's at recordation or. And for simplicity's sake, as a listing agent, I'm recommending you check the box at 6 p.m. because it can be sort of problematic. The buyer wants to move in the second after they get confirmation, and the seller is waiting for confirmation before they move out. There's a bit of an overlap there. So, if you're not having a problem, then don't worry about it. But that's keep that in mind. That's something to consider. Or it can be at whatever time of the day subsequent to an attached SIP or RLAS. And that is the second option. And that is that if you check one of these boxes, possession is not at the close of escrow. It's at whatever the SIP says, which is for 29 days or less, or the RLAS for 30 days or more. So let me talk about those two documents briefly. The SIP is a very nice, simple document, and it is more buyer-friendly than seller-friendly. That's a fact. And the biggest reason is right here. The reason it's very buyer-friendly is the seller shall deliver the property in the condition and on the terms provided in the agreement. Where you have a seller staying in a property and the faucet doesn't work all of a sudden, or even worse, we had this happen twice. The hot water heater goes out while the seller is still in the property. With an SIP, the seller is responsible for putting the hot water heater back to functioning, replacing it maybe. If there's a home warranty, well, then okay, that'll help. But if there's no home warranty, the seller might have $1,000 bill to put a new hot water heater in. Why? Because they have to maintain the property in the condition it was in the agreement. Now, typically, when you give possession, you give the property in the condition it was upon the agreement. And if you're doing a rent back, the buyer has possession for maintaining the property. The seller has possession for living in the property. Why? Because the seller's a tenant. And the SIP is trying to prevent that. Now, it's not been to court yet. There's a little bit of a fear that court don't care what you call it. It's a rental agreement. We don't care if it's 1 day, 29 days, 180 days. It's a rental agreement. There's no law that says you have to use SIPs for 29 days or less. I had an agent tell me that they thought that was required by law. The SIP is not even in the civil code. Carr believes that if you keep a seller possession under 30 days, you might be able to argue it's not a rental agreement. They also know, and I think they're completely correct, any possession over 30 days is probably a rental agreement, no matter what you call it. So that's why they kind of say, okay, well, let's keep it under 30, 29 days or less, and let's argue it's not a rental agreement if the hot water heater goes out. But if the seller says, I'm sorry, I'm not fixing it, I don't own this property anymore, and it went to court, you got a chance the judge would say, tenants don't fix hot water heaters, landlords do. With the RLAS, that's exactly what would happen. So keep in mind, the SIP is a very nice document. It should be used for 29 days or less, because without advising a seller that they're probably not getting, or a buyer rather, that they're not getting this protection on a 35-day SIP, if it goes to court, any possession over 30 days is clearly a rental agreement, is what we believe the courts would say. This would get thrown out. So keep that in mind. That's the biggest difference between an RLA and an SIP on a simple basis. Now, the RLA also has a whole lot of other stuff, because it is RLAS. I'm sorry. It is a rental agreement. So it has all of that information, and it's multi-pages long. Plus, it has all the other things: the bed bugs, the pet addendum, the moisture advisory. Now that's required. The flood zone disclosure, which is also required, is all part of it. And then finally, tenant occupied units. This is important. Anytime a tenant is in the property when the offer is written, check this box right there and include the TOPA. Now, the seller can say, oh, no, the tenant's been given notice, they're going to move out in 2 weeks. Well, fine. The TOPA can state that. The TOP can say that the buyer will be delivered vacant. But right now, you can include the TOP, maybe check this box, but don't omit the TOPA. Why? Because if the tenant doesn't move out and you don't have a TOPA, you have, seller buyer gets possession of the property, period, because you believe the tenant will be out in 2 weeks. If the tenant doesn't move out, the buyer will get all of their damages from the seller because the seller will be obligated to get that tenant out and deliver the property vacant. The TOPA, it has a lot of other stuff about, copies of the rental agreements and what do you do with deposits. But the thing I want to point out is it has protection for the seller that if for some reason, even after making a good faith attempt to get the tenant out, the seller can't get the tenant out, even though he agreed, even though the intent was, I'm going to deliver the property vacant with the TOP. So you use the TOP to say I'll deliver it vacant. Don't omit the TOP. Because if you can't get him out, the buyer's sole remedy is the return of his deposit and the reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspections and appraisals. Not his temporary living expenses and all of that kind of stuff. It can get real expensive if you have a tenant who doesn't get out of a property, but the seller's obligated to sell it vacant and you don't have a TOPA. So rule of thumb, anytime as a listing agent, you sell a property with a tenant in it, even if he's going to get out tomorrow, but the seller is accepting the offer today, you include the TOP in your transaction. That is so important. Okay, providing the FHDS form, if applicable, that's fire hardening and defensible space advisory and addendum. You provide the FHDS if applicable, and it's applicable if it's a high or very high fire zone and the TDS is required. For example, you wouldn't provide it if it's land because there's no TDS for land. You wouldn't provide it if it's 5 units or more. You wouldn't provide it if you're an exempt trustee. An exempt trustee would be a successor trustee, not a trustee of a revocable trust. They are not exempt, but a successor trustee, unless they've lived in the property in the past year, are exempt from the TDS law, and they would be exempt from doing this. So if applicable, most of our transactions are not TDS exempt. So an FHDS would be required if it's in a high or very high fire zone. The recommendation is listing agents provide that with the counter offer. Now, if it's not with the counter offer, be sure you provide it within 7 days of acceptance. And that's contained in paragraph 3 and 1. Now, why is that important? Because of paragraph 4, B. 4B is compliance with defensible space requirements. And 4B says that the buyer, all of the different clauses, well, one of them actually says the seller will do it, but most of them say the buyer will be responsible for the cost of compliance and do it after close of escrow, unless there's a local ordinance requiring compliance, documentation of compliance. That's the key word. There's a law right now that says all properties in high and very high fire zones have to be in compliance. I'm not selling my house. I don't think I am. And I'm in a very high fire zone. I have to be in compliance. But I can sell my house and not get an inspection saying I'm in compliance. Why? Because there's not a local ordinance that says I have to have that inspection as a point of sale. That's the point. So paragraph 4B1, the default paragraph, will apply most of the time. But it says that within 1 year, the buyer will obtain their documentation at no cost to the seller, by the way, and that there is no requirement for the documentation to be provided at close of escrow. Why? Because there's no local ordinance that requires it. So that's, I can tell you there's no jurisdiction in the county of San Diego that requires an investigation pursuant to an FHDS as a point of sale. That's not true of every county in the state. Obviously, you get up to Lake Tahoe, it's quite the opposite. But down here, our local jurisdictions haven't gotten around to making it a point of sale requirement. I think they will eventually, because they actually do think, I've talked to the Escondido attorney, I've talked to the city of San Diego attorney. They believe that the state law says you have to have an inspection. It clearly doesn't say that. And I'm not alone in this. Every attorney on CAR, and I've talked to many of them, and I participate in group calls from the very head attorney all the way down to the most junior attorney on the helplines. They all know that the state requires, for a point of sale requirement, the state law requires that there be a local ordinance requiring it. And San Diego doesn't have one. Escondido doesn't have one, even though the websites will tell you have to have an inspection to sell your house. You do not. So if you have an issue with this, call me. But in general, you're comfortable providing the FHDS, and the B1 box, which is the boilerplate box, is the one. There's no box. It's the one that applies, and you don't need to check box 2 through 4. Any questions on that? I've talked about it a few times. I still get questions. Wanted to kind of take one more opportunity to tell you not to worry about it. Okay, personal property items included and excluded. Of course, you're all familiar with that now. Much better list, much more detailed list of all the things that the buyer might want the seller to provide. The thing I want to point out is that anything on that box that checked is only included if it currently exists. I've had this come up twice already, where the buyer checked something that wasn't part of the property, and common sense would tell you, no, you don't need to go buy one, but you wanted to be sure, so you called me, of course, and I appreciated that. And so we let the buyer know you're not going to get a wine cooler because there isn't one, so keep that in mind. Now, the other thing to change is the brackets. If you are removing your TV from the wall, and most people are, because the TV is still personal property, or your stereo components, if you're moving from the wall, you also remove the brackets and patch the holes. You don't have to paint them, but you have to patch them. The old RPA said you could leave the brackets there, and that was what the boilerplate said. But now they reversed that. They said, no, take your brackets with you. The buyer doesn't want them, and patch those holes up. So keep that in mind. Almost done here. We'll wrap it up pretty quickly. Delivery in the designated electronic delivery address. There's going to be a new form coming out that's going to help agents get the designated electronic delivery address when there isn't one provided. Delivery is defined in paragraph 25K, and delivery is either personally received by the principal or their authorized agent, and their authorized agent is named on page 16, the real estate broker section, or when it's sent, not received, but sent to the designated electronic delivery address specified in the real estate broker section on page 16. So this is what page 16 looks like. You're all familiar with it. You want the buyers, listing agents, you want the buyers to provide this email address because you want to make it easy to give them notices to perform. And likewise, there's one for sellers, and you can put in your information because this is below the signature of the principals. So the principals sign the offer, and then you can write in this information, even though the offer has already been accepted, and then return it to the buyer's agent. You want this. I would argue the buyer's agents want this. It's, I think, critical that the listing agents want the buyer's designated electronic delivery address, so you don't have to make a personal delivery. Absent this address, then you have to personally deliver the notices to perform. Now, you could do that by an email, but you need acknowledgement on their part that they got it. And that's going to be the problem. So you have this, and then you just put this in the to box of your email. And when you hit send button, they got it. So I think we've talked about that before. I just wanted to stress to get that. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I want to point out is the contract requires the entire seller shall return the entire agreement with any response. And that's important to be certain that the liquidated damages and arbitration clauses, that there's mutual agreement on how those were handled. So keep that in mind. All right. That pretty much completes what I have prepared. Do we have any questions?
We do have questions in the chat, Walt. She said, Walt said not to put verbiage about paying over the appraisal on the contract so that it does not commit the seller to coming down. But if we represent the seller and a buyer's agent puts verbiage in the contract, buyer agrees to pay X over the appraised value, what should we do to counter that out?
That's a great question. Okay, now that I understand it, you take, and I could go to my screen and try to get it for you, but you literally take the language right off of the RPA. So you go to paragraph L2, and I'll read it to you now. It says appraisal contingency based upon appraisal value at a minimum of purchase price or blank. So you simply write in a counter, appraisal contingency shall be based upon appraisal at a minimum value of, and you put in that number. So you just counter back the language in 3L2, but modifying it slightly because it's now part of your counter and not part of the RPA. Does that make sense? So you just counter back what they're going to pay $5,000 over appraisal. So what do you believe it'll appraise at? And you make it, you reduce 5,000, they will pay at a minimum of, you take 5,000 off what you believe it'll appraise at. So if you've listed it right, you go to your list price and knock the amount they're going to pay over appraisal. But don't accept that buyer to pay, because the argument could be said that the seller might be accepting that. Another thing you could write is seller shall be obligated to sell the property at the purchase price of, and then you just restate the purchase price, regardless of appraisal. That's another way you could do it, just to protect your seller. The seller shall be obligated to sell the home at the purchase price of, and whatever the buyer offered, regardless of appraisal.
She says yes, thank you.
Okay. Another question?
Yes. Let's see. Chris, he's wondering, what if a buyer removes their inspection contingency, but they still want to do the inspections regardless? You wouldn't do a waiver in that case, correct?
No, you wouldn't. Right. So exactly, because they're going to get get an inspection. So they're not waiving the inspection. So they know what they're buying, but they've removed their contingency. Right. That's a good point.
So there was a section regarding the need to send reports to the seller that mentioned the appraisal. Could you go back and address that section?
That's a great question. I skimmed right past that. The appraisal is not a material fact, with one exception. So what is it? Why do I say that? Because an appraisal is not, you do not need to disclose, as a seller, you do not need to disclose the buyer's appraisal to a future buyer, nor are you entitled to the buyer's appraisal. You are entitled to the physical inspection report because it's that information in that physical inspection report is disclosable, and you disclose it by providing a copy of that report. Okay, so that's why I went that direction. There's one exception. FHA and VA appraisals shall be provided to the seller. So when a buyer gets an FHA or VA appraisal, now I would argue if they close escrow on it, who cares? The seller, only Walt Clyne would care about having more paper in a box somewhere. But you don't need that appraisal per se, but you're entitled to it. You are especially entitled to it if that buyer cancels. Why? Because that appraisal will stick with the property. I believe it's 6 months. I'm pretty sure if we have a lender on the line, they can confirm that. But so the seller has a need to know that, because if they accept another FHA offer, that's the appraisal that they're going to have to live with. And so they want to deal with that knowledge on their future FHA transaction. So FHA and VA appraisals must be provided to the seller if they ask for them, and seller's agent should ask for them if the buyer, an FHA or VA buyer, is canceling, because your seller's stuck with that appraisal with the next FHA VA buyer. Now, do you disclose that appraisal to a conventional buyer? No. You don't have to disclose that. The FHA or VA second buyer is going to find out that information, so you might as well give it to them, because their lender is going to get a copy of that appraisal. That appraisal, as I said, is going to stay with the property. Okay.
So Azim said, so there's no San Diego ordinance. I think he's referring to the fire hardening.
Right. There's no point of sale ordinance. There is an ordinance statewide, and San Diego has their own, which pretty much mirrors the state, that you have to, make your property in compliance. Like I said, there's a city ordinance. I live in the city of San Diego, and there's a state law that says I got to clear brush from the back of my property. I got to keep my firewood away from my house. I got to do all those kinds of things. But I don't have to have a report saying I'm in compliance to sell my house. That's the difference. And so that's what the FHDS addresses in paragraph 4B1. No, there is no local ordinance requiring a report proving I'm in compliance.
Some home inspection companies are providing fire hardening inspections. What are your thoughts?
Well, if I'm the buyer, I probably want to get it. And that's an interesting thing, because if I'm a buyer, I can't call the fire marshal up and have them look at it. Why? Because you can't have a government inspection on a seller's property without the seller's permission. So that's an interesting quandary that Carr Legal is working on now. A buyer who wants to have the fire marshal look at it, the contract prohibits them from, you can't call a City of San Diego or City of Escondido building inspector to come look at this improvement that wasn't permitted to make sure it's okay. Can't have the city do it. You could have a private inspector do it. So likewise, a private inspector doing that's probably a good idea. If I'm a buyer, I think I'd be excited about it. And as a seller, you can't really prohibit the buyer from doing it. So I guess my thoughts are good. Hope it doesn't mess up your transaction, but you can't stop it, nor do you want to, probably.
Azim says that he's referring to a home inspection company, not the fire department.
Right, exactly. Maybe I didn't make that clear. What I was trying to say in too many words, it's good that the home inspection people are doing it, because a buyer can have a home inspection company do it. A buyer cannot call the fire marshal. If you have a buyer and they want to have that inspected, the buyer can't call the fire, because the contract prohibits a buyer from causing a government inspection.
What should be done if you're representing a buyer purchasing a property in a very high fire hazard zone, but the seller will not provide an FHDS because according to the NHD, it's in a wildfire area or a wildland area, wildland fire area? Then
maybe there's some confusion somewhere, because while very high fire zones are specifically mentioned in all NHDs, that's a identifiable zone. A wildfire hazard zone contains both moderate and high. So the problem is the law doesn't affect moderate, but it does affect high. So when you're in a wildland fire, whatever, you have to go into the report to figure out, am I high or am I moderate? And if I'm in a high, then I still have to provide the FHA. But if I'm a moderate, I don't have to provide it. Specifically, if you have a problem like that, call Larry or call me. We're happy to help you, and we're happy to educate the other side if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, or help you understand they're fine, they're not doing anything wrong.
If a buyer purchases a property when the fire hardening disclosure was in existence and then puts the property up for sale, does the 1-year term for that responsibility then become a point of sale issue?
If I understand the question right, the 1 year only starts ticking on the buyer, not on the seller. So if you put the property up for sale for 6 months, the having an inspection within 1 year is only once you sell it and the buyer closes escrow, the 1 year starts with the close of escrow. So that 1 year doesn't affect a seller who has not closed escrow or a buyer who has not yet bought the house. Does that answer the question? Did I understand?
No, Walt, that's mine. Sorry, I probably said it incorrectly. Because the fire hardening disclosure has been around for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
Once the buyer actually purchases that property, if it's in a high fire area, I'm just wondering, because we're going to be coming up on the end of the year and the beginning of next year. Does that 1 year, does the buyer actually have to have an inspection within the year that they own the property? And will it then become a point of sale for the seller once they become a seller, if they have to sell it after that 1 year time frame? Does that make sense?
If they have the inspection, then having the report will be a disclosure.
Okay.
Right. And and it's, unless they change the law. And like I said, I can't believe City of San Diego and the City of Escondido don't change the law when they really do figure it out. Right now, they're thinking that these inspections are required, but they're getting pushback. And cars actually talked to the City of San Diego, partly because I raised so much of a fuss. So until there's a point of sale requirement, there is no inspection required. But if the buyer, after closing escrow, within the 1 year gets an inspection, that is disclosable. And if he doesn't get an inspection, he doesn't have to get an inspection as a result of selling the property.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Those are all the questions in the chat, unless anyone else has questions they'd like to ask now.
All right. Well, don't see any questions coming up. No hands raised. Folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope I've answered a question or two for you. Most of you knew most of what I talked about anyway. So sometimes the best learning is when you're taught what you already know.